Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for tuning in today. So, we're going to continue on slowly changing dimension. We've already done type 0, 1, and 2, and we're going to go to type 3. I want to quickly mention that type 1 and 2 are the most common, but I want you also to be aware of the other types. So, let's quickly dig into it. So, type 3 really track limited previous history, and it's more or less a partial history. Now, I'll explain why. What happens is they only keep the last historical content. Okay, basically add new column to store previous values. So think of cases where you just want to store current city and previous city, so you can see it only refers to previous cities. So if you had multiple instances, right, then it doesn't keep that. That's why we call it a partial history. And the advantage is that it tracks limited history without adding new columns, and also the disadvantage is that only one historical value can be tracked. Okay, let's take an example just to be able to buttress our understanding. So let's say we have an existing table with this particular record. We've seen something like this before, but the only thing I want you to pay attention to here is the previous city. You can see the previous city here is null. Okay, right, and then the current city is still Toronto. Now the incoming change here is that the person has moved to Ottawa, the same example we've been using. What happens for this particular output, right? So the output then tells you that now this has been switched from null to Toronto, right? And this current city has been updated to Ottawa, right? So it keeps that, that particular two values in there. Now the downside, just to buttress, is that let's say for example 6 months or 2 years down the line, the same person moved from Ottawa to Vancouver, right? Well, then you're gonna have Ottawa as a previous city, Vancouver as a current city, then no historical content for Toronto again. So these, depending on what the use case is, sometimes you can decide from the engineering perspective what makes sense to in terms of how to design the table, right? So you can determine that, and also from just designing a new product out of this particular persistent table, you can also tell, oh, this is type 3 they have used, and then based on that perform your analytics as expected. All right, so I hope that you really understand that. So let's go to type 4. So type 4, what it does is that it keeps a separate historical table. What do we mean by that? Okay, so current data stays in the dimension table, and historical versions are stored in a separate historical table. Now this is more like or less a combination of type 1 and type 2. Okay, just think about it like a combination of type 1 and type 2. So now let's take an example. Before that, let's look at advantages. Is that it keeps a cleaner and a faster main dimension table, and the disadvantage is that it requires an additional table just to simplify things for you guys. Okay, so example, let's say assume that the change date is again February 14, 2025. So unless the initial record is the same record we've been looking at before, the person lives in Patel, lives in Toronto, and then we do have an historical table separately. Okay, and you can see this is a type 2 historical table, and you can see it's still in Toronto, and we have the valid form and valid to. Keep in mind, sometimes some people use valid form, they use different names, but really it's the same concept, right? You have the start date and the end date. So this is going to be the start date, and it's going to be the end date. So you can use different names for your column. That's okay. Now we do have these two tables existing right now. So what happened, unless this change is coming in, what happened is that then the output then becomes that would have to update the dimension table. Okay, right? This initial dim customer, say dimensional customer current, will update this to Ottawa, and then we'll add the second column, the second record to this particular historical table, and it will look like this. You can see the dimension table is now taking the new value, and then this is more or less how the type 2 looks like, right? So the concept of having those two tables is what we refer to as type 4. All right, now type 5, it's really very it's debatable in the industry, is what I'm trying to get you to understand. But however, I will explain it in this way, right? It's a mini dimension, and also it has a component of the type 1 concept, right? Now, what are the characteristics we need to take note of? Its fast changing attribute are replaced in a mini dimension. Main dimension contains a foreign key to the mini dimension. When attribute change, a new mini dimension role is created. Okay, the main dimension override the foreign key with a new mini dimension surrogate key type 1. Fact tables store both the main dimension key and mini dimension key, preserving full history. Okay, now the advantage, I know this might be a lot, but in the example we'll break it down. Don't worry about it. But I just wanted you guys to also have that, all of those key characteristics in mind. Okay, now the advantage here is that it maintains a full historical accuracy with fact table while keeping the main dimension small and fast. Okay, now the disadvantage is that it requires more joins and careful ETL orchestration, right? So let's go into the example. This will be really good to explain with the example here. So let's say the change date is the same change date we've been looking at before, and then here you see this same mini dimension. Why do we say it's a mini dimension? So think about this one as a customer profile. Okay, now part of the attribute of the customer profile, we create a different mini dimension table for those particular attributes, but we just reference the key in this main dimension table. Okay, so take for example, here we have the 500 as a surrogate key, here we have 42 as a natural key, the name, and then the customer profile, we have a surrogate key we call 10. Okay, now every time we join back to this table, we can access the income band and we can access the loyalty segment. Okay, so this is how this table relate to this particular table, but they are all part of the dimension table when you really look at it, right? Because in a way we can add these two attributes in this particular table, but this is the concept for type 5. Okay, now one more thing to keep in mind is that now the transactional table or the fact table here has this 10 as the surrogate from customer profile. Okay, which from this 10 you can pull the full name as well as you can pull this additional attribute. Now let's say there's an incoming change, and in this case we are using a different example just to be able to buttress type 5. And just to, before I go into the incoming chain, the type 5 is not very common, but I've seen it in my own hands-on work before, so it's just good to know, both from the engineering side and from the analytics point of view. So let's say the incoming band is 60 to 80k. Okay, the loyalty segment, change also to gold, and the effective date is still February 14, 2025. What will happen to all of the three tables? Let's see. Okay, so this mini dimension table get to keep the historical record. Okay, so this mini dimension keeps the historical record. The main dimension table override that 10 to 11. You can see that, right? So therefore when we pull, we only pull this guy, right? That's a new change. But if we need to go through the historical content, then we won't be able to track it back to historical content just joining this two table. We can't do that with this model. Okay, however, the transactional table then keep that information. Okay, so in a way the transactional table can still be able to link back to the historical content. Now where it becomes very tricky, where you have to pay close attention when you're dealing with this type of table, is because when you're dealing with this fact table, the fact table naturally goes really big because they are transactional in nature, right? So you can have millions of transactions on a particular day, except if you keep a snapshot, or you can have multiple over times, right? So what then happens here is that if you keep this table, this fact table will grow really big in no time, right? Because think of it like having millions of record, and then you keep historical table on top of that, right? So let's say every day we have a million record, and the second day we have another million records. So give or take, you might have 1.5 record, and it grows, so every day is growing by 0.5, even more than that, right? And then you can see how quickly the table becomes big, and what then happen, it might affect performance, and so many things might be impacted. So you have to trade cautiously when you need to use this method, or even stay away from using this particular approach, especially from the engineering side. But also, if you're looking at it from the analytics side, you have to make sure that you are correctly interpreting these tables as expected. All right. All right. So feel free to watch this or review this by yourself and make sure you get the understanding. Okay. Let's move to the last but not the least. Okay. Now, the type C is an hybrid combination. So it takes type 1, type 2, and type 3 all together. And it's very interesting. And we're going to go over the characteristics. So for example, it will have new role created as type 2. It will have type 1. It will also have the previous value. I know that's type 3 where you just keep the previous value, right? So those are things that happens for when you're using type C. And I've seen a couple of tables or a couple of objects that I've worked with or designed myself that we had to make type 6 in nature because of the business requirement. Okay, now the advantage here is that it takes in maximum tracking flexibility, so you have full history. On top of that, if you need to refer to the previous value, easy to refer to. Okay, but the downside of this is that it's very complex to maintain. Okay, you can think of it, you can have type 1, type 2, and type 3 all together in one table. So if you don't know how to deal with type 1, type 2, and type 3, you will easily not be able to deal with this particular object really well. Okay, so let's quickly go through the example and then we'll wrap up for this session. So now let's say the change date is still the same day we've been looking at, February 14, 2025, and we have all of this value as initial value. Again, Toronto, null, and then we have the start date and the end date, and then is current version, right? What happens? So when an incoming change comes in and the Patel has moved to Ottawa, what happens? So what then happened is that the old record or old role closes up, right? So you can see the old role, this one particular one, it's been changed to end at that day that the change came in. Okay, the new role is created, and the new role has its current setting, has its previous setting, and then still also have the end date to be a far future date, and then it's current to be yes, and then it's tracking version 2. So you can see you are seeing an attribute of type 2 that has start date and end date. You are seeing an attribute of type 1 that has the current city, right? The new value, and also you have seen an attribute of type 3 that has the previous city as well alongside. So that's kind of how all of these types really work. But just to summarize, the fundamentals are type 1, maybe type 0, 1, 2, and 3. Those are the fundamentals that you need to focus on, as well as from the engineering perspective, you need to also know the different types so that you can know, based on business requirement, how to best design your object so that it can be it can be designed very well to meet both the current business ask as well as future proof of business requirement. All right, so let's quickly go through this summary table. So as we can see, type 0, keep original, no change. Type 1, override old value, update in place, no history kept. Type 2, full history, insert new role, no. Type 3, keep limited previous values, only the previous value it does keep, and add extra column. And then type 4, history in separate table, right? That's when you have type 1 and type 2 in the same type, okay, as type 4, okay. And then type 5, this is the one that I say you should try and do away with if as much as possible, except if it makes sense for that particular use case or business requirement. And it does use minute dimension, and also have an element of type 1 foreign key override, and also uses fact table as well. Okay, and then for type 6, it uses a combination of 1, 2, and 3, and it does keep the full historical content. Okay, and these are the various type. So I believe this would have really helped you to get a very clearer view of the different way we manage our historical operations, or maybe just overwrite data, right? And I believe this has really been helpful to you. In the next session, we're going to go through some, and this is going to be the last challenge for this particular 30-day challenge. We're going to be focusing on an example where we'll have to put some of this concept into practice. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for tuning in and watching, and I will see you in the next session.